people are able to have a really good life. They have access to cheap noodles. Cities are amazing. And yet, take a look at how people are, especially young people. Youth unemployment, according to the official data, is north of 15%, trending close to 20%. The main source of wealth for most people is parked in property. Something like 3/4 of the wealth is in property. Property has fallen by 25 to 30% across all these big cities. This was the first time in Shanghai where friends have told us that there are sort of these homeless people wandering through the outskirts of Shanghai because all of these migrant workers may have nowhere to go. Based on all of this macro data, migrants are kind of returning to the countryside because they can't find great jobs. The college-educated young people, mostly men, are doing delivery drivers because they can't find great jobs. All these young people are sort of living with their parents, which is kind of a fine lifestyle. And for me, the most amazing fact about China now is that Shanghai is such an amazing city. And no one wants to have kids.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Odd Lots podcast. I'm Tracy Alloway.
And I'm Joe Weisenthal.
Joe, I might have heard, just a little bit, that you went to China for the first time.
I haven't been that obnoxious about it. I haven't okay, can I just say one thing? I didn't I've posted about it. I've talked about it. I did not come home and do like a 20-tweet thread about like China's like future in the world, which I consider myself to be a heroic act of restraint.
So you're not a China expert after your one day in Shenzhen.
I fully admit that I'm not a China hand after one day. And I will also say I can't do that anyway because I got over the border on a tourist visa. So I'm not even,
You know the China expert pipeline, right?
How does it work?
So you gotta, first of all, you have to go to China and be an English teacher for a few months. And then you have to move there and become a China consultant.
Yes.
And then you have to start a YouTube channel and start calling yourself Joe Y or Lao Weisenthal.
Yeah. Someone said Zhou Shandao would be a good China signification of my name, which I thought was decent. That actually almost happened to me.
What?
There's a different version of my life. So when I was in college at University of Texas, I saw a poster on the campus. Now, this was Taiwan, but I would have learned the language. It said, come be an English speaker in Taiwan. So I was like, I didn't have any plan for my life or anything like that. And I called the number. And I didn't have a cell phone at the time because we just shared a house phone. And I called the number and I left it. And then the person on the other side called back. But one of my roommates answered the call and ended up getting the job and going to Taiwan. And I always think about that version of my life where I wouldn't be doing Odd Lots because I was home and answered that call. And would I be one of those people that helped American businesses source parts in southern China?
What a segue, Joe.
Yeah, well, that's you reminded me that there is this one of the various versions of my life that was actually kind of one of them.
All right. Well, I'm sure you have your own impressions of China for the first time.
Based on 24 hours.
Based on 24 hours. I know you do because you did tweet about it a lot. But there's someone else we talk to when we want to get general China impressions, take the temperature on the vibes in China, I guess. And that is the one and only Dan Wang. He's been on the show a number of times before. He is, of course, the author of Breakneck, China's Quest to Engineer the Future, also a fellow at Stanford's Hoover Institution. So Dan, thank you so much for coming back on Odd Lots.
Tracy, it's great to be back home.
Oh, thank you.
So vibes in China. Well, first of all, was this your first time going back in a couple years?
It's sort of been my first time going back. So
give us the timeline of when you left and
I left at the start of 2023, right after the total collapse of zero COVID. And then I was back in Yunnan, just finishing my book, writing in the mountains in the south of the province.
Sounds so nice.
Yeah.
And then this time I spent about a month in China between Shanghai for 2 weeks and then Yunnan for 2 more weeks. And I think the big news when I was in China was there were 2 big things happening in New York. One was that the Knicks won some sort of sports ball. And then
it's another thing I heard a little bit about, just a little.
Yeah, and then Joe Weisenthal went to Shenzhen. That was big news on Twitter that day.
I watched the Knicks game from a rooftop bar in Shenzhen.
No kidding.
The game where they clinched it, Game 5, which is wild. Just to give us your background, I mean, we've talked about your book and stuff like that. You're Canadian, right?
Yes.
So that's why the red shirt today, you're wearing maple leaf colors to sort of represent your Canadian heritage on the podcast.
Absolutely.
Okay, I just wanted to establish that. Where did you go? That's why I'm not no expert, because I only spent 24 hours in like one of the country's most advanced cities. But where were you?
Yeah, well, I've lived in the 3 major big zones of China. I was spent 2 years living in Hong Kong, where I played board games with this new entrant to Hong Kong, namely Tracy Alloway. Remember all of these board games that we used to play?
Oh, that was so much fun.
We were in all of these cafes. And I spent 2 years living in Hong Kong, and I thought, well, this really isn't enough real China. And so then I moved to Beijing for 2 years. And then I decided that was way too much real China. And then I decided I should move to Shanghai.
Can I just ask a quick question? I don't know anything about how like Chinese immigration policy or visa policy works. As someone who is ethnically Chinese but a Canadian passport holder, what is required to establish semi-residency, either on like a full-time or sort of part-time work or whatever? Are there any restrictions? How easy is that process?
If you're of Chinese heritage, it's somewhat easier to visit China. There are these specific visa categories, namely family visit, which gets you multiple entry, probably for 10 years. That makes it really easy for someone like me to visit grandma. But I don't think for any other Chinese heritage people, it becomes much easier. They're not necessarily favored to actually live in China. And when I was visiting China at this time, what was really striking was how many more Russians and Russian you hear in the streets of Shanghai. You see more Arab folks walking around, presumably doing business deals, and how few Americans you hear on the streets as well. And so, this has been like a really stark shift in the composition of the foreign people there. And then there's also just been a stunning collapse in immigration to China. And so this Irish guy, Sam Enright, came up with this figure to establish that China and Ireland, China has slightly fewer immigrants than Ireland does. So Ireland, a country of 6 million people, has about 1 million immigrants. China, 1.4 billion, has about 1 million immigrants. And so these are the sort of stunning things where it takes a few more Joe Weisenthals for visiting to prop up the foreign market there.
Lau Weisenthal, we're calling him now.
Lau Weisenthal, yeah, sounds good.
Why did you decide to go to Shanghai and not Beijing? And how much should I read into that as like a shift in the center of power within China, or like more focus on tech and finance?
Yeah, I love Shanghai. Shanghai is, I think, one of the great cities of the world. And Beijing is not. Beijing is not.
I really like Beijing. It has that sort of like northern frontier feel. I really enjoy it, but I've been to Shanghai too, and it is very impressive.
Well, Beijing is this desert steppe city with Stalinist characteristics. And, there's kind of this threat of apocalypse that hangs over there. You don't like the
ring roads, Dan?
I don't love the ring roads. These streets are way too long, and they're way too wide. And, I was in Beijing once this dust storm swept through the city where everything turned yellow. I thought I woke up sick that day, but I guess everything was yellow that day. So there's some charm, definitely, to Beijing. But when we were living in Shanghai, we were calling ourselves the Paris of the East. Mm-hmm. We were calling Paris the Shanghai of the West. And then we were calling Beijing Western Pyongyang. Why would you visit West Korea? So, these are the sort of things where, we are happily dismissive of the Beijing life. There's definitely parts of the Beijing life which feels much more intellectual. The Communist Party really is much more centered there. The great universities are much more centered there. Shanghai prizes much more convenience and comfort. And that's in part because the French literally built a major section of the city. You have these leafy boulevards, you have these cafes everywhere. It's super walkable. You're never that far from a subway station.
Sorry, which city?
Shanghai is much better.
Yeah.
And then Beijing was essentially designed by Stalin, so it can't be all that pleasant.
I will say Beijing is the only place in the entire world where I ever developed eczema. I had it for like 3 months just in Beijing, never had it ever again.
I have these
I don't know what that
headaches that come at random times when I was living in Beijing. And that was the only city where I actually had to experience that.
It's so strange.
If we ever do a live episode of the podcast in China, I guess we don't have to do Beijing. I don't know. You kind of...
I would prefer Beijing to Shanghai. Shanghai might actually be the smarter choice because our audience is probably bigger there.
Yeah.
But I really like Beijing. I don't know. I like the food.
Maybe we could... I know there's so much food I want to try. I had... one thing that... So like, again... in my 24 hours, and you've talked about this, but in my 24 hours, like, there are many things that stood out. But the one thing that's, and I you know, here I'm going to commit an act of modest journalism. The one thing that stood out that I can't get out of my head from visiting China that, you know, I saw all kinds of had great food. I saw the Electronics Mart, et cetera.
No, tell us a little bit more.
More than anything else, okay, so we're sitting here, the three of us are talking. I'm physically in pain right now, like that I haven't checked my phone 5 times. Like that in this conversation. Like it's very difficult for me to like go, we've been talking for 9 minutes so far. So normally I would have checked my phone 5 minutes. But I could do it. But like I have never been in a culture, in a city, etc., in which there was more just like constant phone use. Like that is the one thing I still just cannot get out of my head. I went to a nice dinner, everyone with their screen up, you know, which would be very, I think, like, if you did that in New York, that would be considered really rude, I think, to have your phone.
And yet, Joe.
No, I don't. Like, to have your phone face up on the table. I was like really stunned. And you've talked about this too. And I'm sort of like, I kind of want to talk about phone culture.
Okay, let's talk about phone culture. Joe, what is the right number of times to check your phone in 10 minutes? Is it 5? Is it 500?
Yeah, I don't know. This is, I'm totally up. You know, because the thing was, I was like, oh, I don't want to be rude, but I want to take some pictures and maybe I want to tweet something. But I don't want to be rude. And then I would like look around and like everyone was on their phone. So I was like, oh, I guess it's not rude. Great. I felt great. I loved it.
I am much more New York culture. Stop looking at your phone, man. Let's have a debate about this, Joe.
Yeah, no, great.
So, what do we need to check? What's so important on the phone that we can't talk to each other about face to face right now?
But look. I'm glad that we have this conversation where the expectation is that we have our phones down. But like, when you went back to China recently, did you have the same sense that I did?
Yeah, totally. I think that a lot of good friends would be around a table and then they would start pulling their phone and what are they doing on their phone? It's actually totally trivial stuff. They're kind of just checking the progress of their JD.com or Alibaba deliveries. They're kind of scrolling through some photos that they just taken and deleting a few, selecting a few. And it's like, not everyone is able to get together all the time. So, is that the most important thing right now? Definitely phone culture has broken Joe Weisenthal Lauwai's brain.
Yeah.
But hasn't it broken like hundreds of millions of people's brains across the world?
Yeah.
And there is something, I think, not to be a boomer about this.
No, that's fine. That's great.
Important about attention. But what do you think? Should we,
Look, I'm just going to leave it this, which is that as much as I'm guilty of it, I don't think that the always checking of phones is a healthy part of New York society or American society. Like I think I am participating in something that is unhelpful and not an not pro-social every time I check my phone in a group environment, or even when I'm alone, I should be reading a book instead. And so like, I was just stunned by the degree of like, and then you walk into a store and every store in the mall has a girl live streaming on whatever the equivalent of TikTok is of like what's happening in the store. Like the degree of like phoneness was wild.
As someone who is often the victim of Joe's phone addiction, I will say it does make me sad when I'm talking to you and you literally like leave the conversation mid-sentence to go take a photo of someone's t-shirt and tweet it, which happened last week.
Yeah. Tracy, you and I are going to have dinner and Joe can be off on the side, like tweeting like a toddler. And then you and I can have like a much more serious conversation. What do you think?
This is why I'm actually glad I have this job, because it's an hour at a time throughout various times of the week.
Wait, okay,
in which I don't look at my phone.
Let's get back on track.
Yeah.
Let's do China. Okay.
Yeah.
How much of the Chinese phone obsession, I'm thinking how to phrase this, but how much of it is just because your entire life is basically oriented on your phone now? And I know we could say something similar about the US, but I feel like, you know, payment systems, online shopping are even more endemic in China than they are here.
Yeah, well, so this is where we should praise, you know, what enables the phone culture. First of all, let's say you have this amazing mobile infrastructure where 5G is truly everywhere. And, you know, it is kind of odd to me that you head into pockets of New York, namely the subway, as well as many other places, like, you know, kind of remote parts, and you just kind of drop out of cell access. And you know, I kind of wish that we had mobile access everywhere. And there is kind of this broader phenomenon in East Asia where people have super long commutes on the subway, let's say like an hour to get into Tokyo, you know, an hour to get into central Shanghai or Shenzhen. And, you know, having mobile games and having phones is kind of just a great way to pass the time in your cool, well-connected subway. So there's some good things here. And you have basically a lot more apps that are highly functional. You're able to order absolutely anything you want into your door. You know, 15 minutes, you can get an amazing croissant. And so there are some good parts here. But let's also get into the bad parts. So the bad parts are when you're in China, you're kind of constantly expected to be on for your boss all the time. And so, you know, if we were in China, we have like 3 producers sitting behind us. We're going to have Joe Weisenthal Laowai texting them all the time about, you know, pick up this or that. And so I think that is less pleasant.
It does. Sorry, just to jump. It does seem self-reinforcing, which is that if everyone is on their phone, everyone then becomes expected to text back within the minute, which means you can't opt out of always looking at your phone. Anyway, keep going.
This is the other thing. So I know you're always on your phone. And so when I WhatsApp you and you don't immediately reply,
I don't have pop-ups
I get insulted.
Just DM me. Just Twitter DM me. Anyway, keep going. But yes, Tracy she's like, I know you're looking at your phone. Why haven't you responded?
Yeah.
He has a very limited like bandwidth in which to reply.
I know.
But go on. Just keep talking about Chinese phone culture.
I can text Weisenthal like in 30 seconds. I know he ought to reply. So why isn't he replying within 3 minutes? But so, I mean, the good thing is that you can always use your friends, and that's always good too. But myself, I think I'm much more of an American, whatever, European about this. I just silence all of my notifications. My friends can't really reach me. I think it's better that way. And I think I prefer it not to be reached whenever at anyone else's pleasure. But, you know, if you need to like call someone, you know they're almost always going to pick up.
Wait, but talk about influencers, because this is like this. When we were in Shenzhen, at one point, the guy who I was going around with was like, "Oh, this is a really nice new apartment. It's like all the influencers live there." Talk about like influencer culture there.
Yeah, well, this is also one of these things that make China increasingly highly unpleasant to me now. The extent to which everyone is just photographing themselves as kind of the main thing. So I usually go visit Shanghai and Yunnan, which are, I think, without a doubt, the 2 most beautiful parts of China. And you know, the good thing about being in beautiful parts is that you have a wonderful city, you have this wonderful province. But what sort of distresses me is how many cafes in Shanghai are just places where young people, overwhelmingly women, park to take photos of themselves. Perhaps a group of 7 might order 1 or 2 coffees to the disappointment of the cafe owners, and then they park themselves there for like an hour or so taking photographs. And so many of these Shanghai city blocks have been almost re-architected to be photo spots, whether these are outdoors or whether these are restaurants. And so, you know, that's just a lot of photography. Have you noticed something like this here?
Oh, yeah.
I mean, I would say this describes the West Village in large part,
For sure. I still remember the very first time I went to Dominic Ansel in New York.
Oh, yeah.
And everyone was taking photos of the food. And I was like, oh, like food is now performance art. Basically. But okay, so is influencer culture that's standing in the way of Xi Jinping's drive to increase consumption? Is that what we're saying?
I think that's must be a part of it, because at some point you wonder the extent to which phone culture becomes a substitute for real spending on holiday. So as I just mentioned, you have cafes, you may have cocktail bars in which a gaggle of people come over and then buy 2 drinks, and then they spend the rest of their time photographing themselves. Maybe you can say that the constant photography is a boon for live streaming, and so that promotes some aspect of consumption. But I think overwhelmingly, people are substituting away real experiences to, let's say, have like a super nice, travel experience when they could just photograph themselves. Because the other part of being in Yunnan, which is in the Southwest, this is the region where my family is from. This is highly mountainous. It's essentially Tibet in the north. It's part of the Himalayas, literally, in the north. And then in the south is basically a giant rainforests. And in between, there are basically 25 of China's nearly 60 official ethnic groups. And so what these richer, again, overwhelmingly girls from Shanghai, Beijing, Shenzhen would do is that they go to Yunnan, dress in this ethnic garb, pretend that they're Tibetan for a day, take some, a snow-covered mountains as a backdrop. There are parts of New York, Miami, LA that have been re-architected, but I think phone culture is much more extreme. But Joe, did you consider dressing up as a Tibetan?
No, but I know that if Tracy and I ever go to China together, I'm going to have to take a lot of Tracy's going to make me do that.
For sure.
Absolutely, for her Instagram.
You're a decent photographer.
Thanks.
So, it helps.
I might be part Tibetan myself. This is part of the family lore. When the Tibetans come up to me, they always say "Tashidale," and so maybe I.
What does that mean?
Just their hello, standard greeting. And maybe the 3 of us can do an awesome photo shoot. This is one time I'll do a photo shoot.
This is now. We're going to do a road trip, and we're going to make this happen.
I would actually do that trip. You described this as mostly girls, and this is also a phenomenon in the West. But why? What is the ultimate goal of taking all these photos and sticking them on social media? Is it, dating? Is it building a professional brand? Is it just socializing with your online friends?
Tracy, I don't look at these photos, so it's only speculation for me. But I think it has to be all the same phenomenon where, women everywhere feel like they have to perform for the gram, or in the case of China, for the xiaohongshu. And I think the added layer in China is just that it's kind of a cheap way to have fun and to establish that you've been there. And, these are kind of beautiful things, and you do spend a lot of effort on makeup. And so I think it could be kind of fun, but so why not? So when I am sometimes upset by the photo culture, I remind myself, these ladies aren't harming me. So no skin off my nose. They should have a great time.
They're not harming you. No skin off your nose. On the other hand, I don't really know much about how are your male relatives doing in China? And the only reason I ask is actually because I'm aware that in Korea, which, is a totally separate country, people talk about the gender gap in politics here in the U.S., that the gender gap in politics in Korea specifically is extraordinarily large, and that the sort of 4chanification of politics in Korea seems like even far more advanced than it is in the West. There's no electoral politics in China, so we don't really get to read articles about how these feelings express themselves at the ballot the same way. But how would the Dan Wangs, your cousins or friends, male friends, how are they feeling?
Yeah, well, I think you guys have done this a remarkable job of keeping this conversation on track. But I think we need to get this back on track and talk about my male pseudo relative, Joe Weisenthal Lauweiss, slight time in China. And I notice, Joe, for those watching on camera, you have a Chinese ethnic garb yourself. You have an Anta shirt on you. Yeah. So we're going to ask you to, talk a little bit more about your impressions, 24 hours though they may be. And I'm just going to offer one more proverb, a well-known ancient Chinese proverb here about visiting China. So, everyone knows that, you visit China for 24 hours, you feel like you can write a book.
Yeah.
Visit China for a week, you start, having some doubts. You live 6 years in China and you realize you know nothing. Yeah. So, what's the book in you, Joe, that you're going to give to us?
I don't mean to brag.
Yeah.
But I actually do not have, I feel very viscerally that I only got the tiniest slice. And maybe just because I've been doing media for a while, I really do not feel like I could say anything useful about China from 24 hours.
Just tell us how you felt.
I mean, I had a great time. It's all the cars are real, that all the cars that we see on social media, they're all real. The food is all great. I spent a night in the Park Hyatt, which was probably one of the top 3 or 4 hotels I've ever spent a night in. And it was $250, which would be the grimiest hotel off of Times Square. But it was just 24 hours.
Some cool tech stuff as well.
And I went to the tech mall and I bought for $15 this eye massager. I almost bought a suitcase that could double as a scooter for a grown adult person and ride around the airport, but I was worried about the batteries and
I wish you'd gotten that.
I know my son would have loved it. If I showed him a video, he'd be so upset that I didn't get that for him. But all of this, basically in that 24 hours, it was all the social media stuff that I'm inundated by. I was oh, all of it is at least in this one city, incredibly advanced, an entire city as big as New York, where all the offices are about as feel like the new JP Morgan headquarters. Yeah, it's extraordinary.
What did you not like about this experience? Walking around?
No, I liked it. I actually didn't I found it to be a very pleasant 24 hours.
Right.
Including, I went and bought some cigarettes for friends. I don't smoke, but some friends do. And currently in New York, Chinese cigarettes are very highly sought after.
I had no idea.
Yeah,
really?
This is the thing for sure.
What's the brand?
Well, I got a Chunghua. I don't know. But I bought a bunch of other brands. I'll show you the box. I mean, they don't have the labels on them.
We're going to go out for a smoke after this.
Yeah, that's fine. But when I went to the cigarette and liquor dealer, you walk in and the first thing he just starts pouring tea for everyone and opening packs for you to try. I was this is great. I mean, this is a good life.
Yeah.
But you're the guest, so you got to tell us this
liquor and cigarettes. Good life.
No, after this we're gonna drink some baijiu. We're gonna have a huazi, which is kind of how you refer to a cigarette there, and then I don't love Shenzhen. I really feel like Shenzhen is America's answer to San Jose. We kind of talk about Shenzhen as the Silicon Valley of China, and I think it's just kind of the San Jose. It's kind of these big midtown buildings. It's a lot of office parks. I mean, the nice thing about it is it's really green, but it's the parts of the city is really centered between the east and the west, and to get between them, you have to get on this big highway. So
I was on that highway.
Urban design is not great, and so this is why I think Shanghai is still much better. And I think that when people are in China, I think the central contradiction, as the Marxists like to call it now, is that what I feel on this trip is that this is kind of people have a bit of a serene discontent with their lives.
Ennui, sort of.
Sorry.
Ennui, kind of.
Maybe everyone does, but I think it is a little bit more extreme in China. So on the one hand, the products are really, really amazing. So you have these, amazing, suitcase rollers that you can sit and roll around.
Yeah. It's all real.
Paul Blart Mall Cup, Joe Weisenthal Laowai airport roller guy. And when I was in Shanghai this time, I was really struck by the amazing food culture there. I mean, just in terms of, the coffees now all have these infusions that make them look almost like caffeinated cocktails without the alcohol. So, why not have your coffee being infused with some sort of honeydew melon and rose water, all these amazing things, and they taste really good. And I'm thinking, oh, why am I getting a standard Americano when it can have something like this? The croissants are really, really amazing. I love baked goods. And so, the Shanghainese croissants are approaching Parisian, maybe Copenhagen levels of quality, Tokyo levels of quality. I spend a lot of time talking about how China builds a ton of electrical power, solar, wind, nuclear, etc. And then I learned how much it costs to charge your electric vehicle to the full range of about 600 kilometers. It's about $12 to have essentially a full tank of gas.
Yeah, wow.
And that's kind of totally amazing. And so people are able to have a really good life. They have access to cheap noodles. Cities are amazing. And yet, take a look at how people are, especially young people. Youth unemployment, according to the official data, is north of 15%, trending close to 20%. the main source of wealth for most people is parked in property. Something like 3/4 of the wealth is in property. Property has fallen by 25 to 30% across all these big cities. This was the first time in Shanghai where friends have told us that there are sort of these homeless people wandering through the outskirts of Shanghai because all of these migrant workers may have nowhere to go. And based on all of this macro data, migrants are kind of returning to the countryside because they can't find great jobs. The college-educated young people, mostly men, are doing delivery drivers because they can't find great jobs. All these young people are sort of living with their parents, which is kind of a fine lifestyle. And for me, the most amazing fact about China now is that Shanghai is such an amazing city, and no one wants to have kids. No one wants to have kids. So the national TFR rate in China, and this is the official data, is 1.0, and Shanghai is 0.6, which is on par with Taipei and Seoul. And there are aspects, the richest parts of Shanghai, the TFR, official TFR, is like 0.4. And so how can this function when, in a couple of years, in something like, I think 20 years, half the population will be north of 65. How can the city function when half the people expect to be retired? And how can the country function when there's no young people? And this is something that I used to be a little bit more sanguine about, the demographic cliff. This is where, are we going to see a completely different China in 15 years? That's I'm much less sanguine about that.
Yeah, I mean, this is seeing these global stats and being at a place where it's like, okay, it's not so expensive and transport is very easy with children, et cetera. And yet still, fertility is collapsing like that. Unfortunately, it definitely makes me more skeptical of a lot of the claims that, like, oh, if only we had like free childcare in the US or whatever, that would like make people more inclined to have families and stuff like that. Like, it doesn't seem like these physical material affordances actually do much on that front.
Well, I was going to ask Dan, what's your theory for declining birth rates in China? Because you hear all these different things about, like the work culture is too intense, the educational culture is too intense, life in general is too intense. What do you think?
Yeah, yes. And I mean, the first thing to say is that China is not an outlier in East Asia. So.
It's not an outlier anywhere. It's ahead of the curve. But there's not a place in the world, including Africa, including Central and South America, et cetera, where we don't see fertility rates basically falling off a cliff.
Yeah, but I mean, I think there may even be a qualitative difference between TFR of what is US now, 1.6, 1.7, and 1.0. And so the exponential math here really starts doing their punishing math. So in East Asia, Japan is actually now kind of is something like 1.2, 1.3. And they have they're further down the demographic curve, but have a higher TFR at the moment, and they're much more open to immigrants. And so, should we be more optimistic about Japan or China? Japan is more open to immigrants and has higher TFR. So maybe that's
I just on a statistical methodology question? Does the national Japanese TFR include the immigrant population, which might have a higher TFR than the ethnically Japanese population?
Surely, but I suspect that the immigrants are not that big a part of the population really to affect that. And, I think the East Asian problem, if I had to boil this down to one thing, and obviously life is complex, but the one thing has to be the educational culture, where people feel like if their kid can't get into the right university, then their life is over, and therefore they need to get into the right kindergarten to get into the right university. And if they can't live in this particular section of Shanghai or Shenzhen, then they might as well not have a kid at all. And I think it's also worth acknowledging all of these other pressures that families pile on the kids, that your life is so oriented towards education. And then, after education, it's so oriented towards getting a great job in finance or tech. And then, once you've checked off that box, the parents are telling you, women face only one question in China. when are you going to marry to the unmarried, and when are you going to have kids to those without kids, and just all of these social pressures that keep reproducing themselves. I think it's like a wonder that anyone has children.
This actually gets to something that I regret not talking about, and it's the last time we had you on the podcast, which was last year, and we were talking about your book Breakneck.
Yeah.
And around the same time that I read your book, I also read Eva Dou's book about Huawei and like the culture they had there. And one thing that she really emphasizes in that book and other about this extraordinary company is like this sort of, yes, of course they have like plenty of brilliant engineers, et cetera, but they also have like this culture that probably is a sort of silhouette of CCP culture, maybe is a way to put it, and how like the company's founder instilled a certain like willingness to die within the company's cadres, and they would therefore win the contract to build 5G in Iraq or win the contract to build 5G in Afghanistan because they would not leave the country while everyone else would. And there are these certain that strikes me as like a cultural change or a difference in corporate culture that is not simply about, say, the engineers versus lawyer brain that you discuss in your book. And so when you talk about some of these like intense cultural forces about getting into the right school, et cetera, when you read about this sort of like imbuing of the Huawei ideology within the company, et cetera, is there something else going on that drives these companies to the technological frontier, to success, beyond just, as the sort of engineering mindset that you discussed? They're an ideological component.
Yeah, well, Eva Dou's book is great on Huawei. I blurbed it. I think everyone should read it. And, to read these descriptions of the wolf culture, I think is the term on Huawei. They rush towards Afghanistan.
Yeah.
And so I think that there is definitely an element here that is very real. And I would say that this is more kind of a developing country's hustle mindset. Because, who else had this culture? New York City of 100 years ago. Joe, you still live in the Lower East Side?
Yeah, I still do.
I hear there's a lot of people there.
Yeah.
Where there's a lot of people, Lower East Side 100 years ago when there were like 15 people living in a single room, or,
right.
So, and the U.S. definitely had this.
Yeah.
And so the U.S., people would, rush forward. And so this is where I think this is kind of just, capitalism. Mm-hmm. And my view is that if you want to appreciate, capitalism red in tooth and claw, you go to Shanghai, you go to Shenzhen, you go to Beijing, you go to all of these places where people just really work their asses off because they believe that there is, something worth pursuing for. And the U.S. used to have this, and I think that the China very, very deliberately picked up as much as it could from the United States. The cities are kind of built more like the U.S. cities, much more of a car culture. My phone charger plugs into the U.S. and China more easily than it plugs into anywhere in Europe. So, they copied the U.S. a lot, and they copied everything from the U.S. aside from the political system. And so they've decided that they got to hustle. And so maybe, you're a New York hustler, Joe, and, this is what attracts you about China today.
In an earlier stage of my life, maybe I was. Now I'm sort of just like, I'm fine to.
Wait, since you mentioned the wolf thing, what's the nationalist temperature like at the moment in China?
I think it is fairly steady, and I think that my sense of part of what ails the Chinese economy right now is that Xi Jinping has his wish come true, and I think that top leader Xi Jinping's main goal is to militarize and harden the country for great power competition with the United States. And I have a chapter in my book called Fortress China. And I think this is much more of a fortress mentality in which everything has to be about pursuing the semiconductors and pursuing the batteries and making sure that social pressures are not blowing off a lid. And I think that they it seems to me like the top levels of the Communist Party is pretty comfortable with where things are, in spite of the collapse in property, in spite of youth unemployment being almost 20%, because they're having their wishes come true on the chips and the batteries and on all of these high technology pursuits. And when President Trump visited Beijing, the White House social media was almost treated Trump as a supplicant. There was these photos, in which Xi was pointing the way and Donald Trump was kind of nodding along. And so there's all of these things where this is much more about great power versus great power, and in great power, the little people don't really matter all that much. And so this is much more about the elite, 10%, 1%, 0.1% of the engineers still being able to achieve everything that they want to achieve. And all of these resources are funneled towards them, and power is made really cheaply to them. And so, they want to pursue it.
So one thing we've talked about before is the lack of cultural exports from China. Labubu's notwithstanding.
I thought this was going to be the one. I thought this was going to be the one, and that lasted about 5 minutes.
Yeah. What do you think is needed to sort of unlock a cultural explosion in China? Because the impulse must be there, right?
Yeah. How about some marijuana? And I don't think that this is something that...
I didn't expect you to say that, but go on.
Marijuana and the dropping of censorship. How about that? And I don't think that is going to be real anytime soon. So I was pretty deliberate on my trip to Shanghai this time. I went to go see a lot of stand-up comedy in Shanghai, which is something that's really booming. And so they have kind of more of these online specials now, in which comics are doing shows, and then offline is actually a real phenomenon as well. And I went to shows, one of which was English speaking. I didn't choose that, but it was just happened to be there that day. And it was kind of these, American expats who were English teachers mostly, who were giving this show. And for the most part, the audiences were amazing. They love to play along. They give amazing joke answers back. I think the Chinese audience is really, really fun. Comics were not as funny as I hoped. I mean, I don't see that much comedy in New York, and so it's not really a good comparison. But the Chinese comic that I saw was essentially telling a series of skits. And it's not stand-up as I understand it. He was essentially telling these elaborate jokes, which kind of he constructed, which didn't really happen to him. And so it wasn't all that funny to me, but I think it would be great if there were more Chinese jokes out there. But the fact of Shanghai comedy was that, something like 3 years ago, one of this really big comic in China made a pun off of one of these core military slogans. And what happened? What happened to him? All of these comic clubs in Shanghai were shut for, I think, something like 4 months. And they all closed down in Shanghai. And across these festivals, across all of these public performances, the comics have to submit their scripts to the censors before they can do their routine. And so how can that possibly be excellent for creativity?
This actually gets me to one more question. In addition, the other book that I read last year, the other China book that I read last year was the book about Xi's dad.
Turigian, Joseph.
Joseph, which is great. And I guess he's like your Hoover Institute colleague. And my reading of that book, which I thought was very interesting, and it speaks directly to this, is that one way to think about the sort of post-Mao era is, how do you keep a hard line while not tipping into true cultural revolution territory? And this fear, because what you described, where it's and there was a story in the Wall Street Journal recently about Xi Jinping cracking down on people who are into mysticism and so forth. But it's easy to see how these things spill over, right? Because if you're my boss and you tell me to stop with the mysticism, then I'm going to bully the 10 people who are a little bit mystical in my arena. And then they'll, and everyone replicates the bullying. And then suddenly you're back in cultural revolution territory. That's it seems how the way these things propagate to me. And I'm sort of curious, when we look at the fortress China that you talk about, Do you think it's inured from a future cultural revolution at some point in the future by the way these things propagate?
Yeah, I mean, this is quite a chain of dominoes you've constructed, Joe. You know, first you take away everyone's tarot cards, and then the cultural revolution erupts a little bit later.
Well, everyone, you know, you take away my tarot cards, then I'm like going to prove that I'm even harsher on the people I know who like, you know, look at astrology websites.
Perhaps. Now, I think that I'm spending more time in Silicon Valley, and the opening line of my letter this year was that one thing that Silicon Valley shares with the Communist Party is that both are serious, self-serious, and indeed completely humorless. The Central Committee is not a bunch of yucks. Yeah. And I think it is our misfortune, our global misfortune, that we are ruled right now by Silicon Valley on the one hand and the Communist Party on the other. And these are completely humorless people that are kind of reshaping a lot of what we buy and what we think. And that is kind of nuts to me. And I think this is also why, how great are Silicon Valley's cultural exports? I don't know. I don't think it's great products, and just like the Chinese. And there's some great products. I think there's going to be, Chinese marketing has not really kept up. We don't really have amazing associations with Chinese brands as such. But I think that will change because the quality is going to improve. But I think if you're looking for any sort of a bottom-up culture, it is still remarkable how stunted Chinese cultural exports are relative to, let's say, the Koreans with, all of this K-pop, Squid Game, all of that. You have Americans who are much more eager to study the Korean language at college now. I think that is actually outpacing people studying Chinese in college now. So, China might do much better, but I would say by any measure, it is an underperformer relative to its population and its economic growth.
All right, Dan Wang, thank you so much for coming back on Odd Lots and giving us the vibes in China.
A true China hand. Thank you so much, Dan. That was fantastic.
Yeah, let's have some photo shoots in China, and we'll get on some yaks. We'll look like Tibetans, and then we'll have a great time.
I think
while drinking lychee flavored coffee, right?
And smoking cigarettes. The three of us are going to do a road trip one day.
Absolutely,
we're going to make this happen. I can't wait. Thanks so much. That was great.
Very good.
Always fun to catch up with Dan, Joe.
I love talking to Dan. And that was a different one. We didn't talk too much like, what is the secret recipe of like batteries? And
building
like
giant infrastructure projects.
Yeah, I like talking about influencer culture. And that last anecdote about stand-up comedy was really interesting as well.
Yeah. So stand-up comedy, obviously very different in China versus the U.S., although maybe the U.S. is heading in that trajectory in some ways. But what stood out to me in that conversation is actually like there are a lot of similarities, I think, between like some of the social ennui that we seem to have in the US and the what did Dan call it? Silent discontent or quiet discontent in China.
Sorry, before going on to that, I happen to follow I think she's Kyrgyzstani stand-up comic on Instagram. Mm-hmm. And it's really funny because she like makes these jokes about like other like distinct ethnic pockets within Kyrgyz. It's like so-and-so men do this and stuff like that. Anyway, I like seeing like these patterns like replicated all around the world. But I do think this is very interesting that there are certainly like, let's say the collapse of fertility. They say that's a pathology in some way or something like that. Or everyone like these are global phenomena. And maybe the East Asian countries are just sort of like the most further along down this trajectory for one reason or another. The phone stuff, the influence, it doesn't. And then also, and I remember when we did that episode earlier this year about like the Chinese internet and like people there's like this more nationalist flavor. Yeah. That's the same here.
I know.
So it does, I think to your point. It feels
like it's convergence.
There's sort of like global cultural convergence that everyone is sort of I guess what I would say is even in very different economic conditions, there is this sort of cultural convergence happening. And you say it's like, okay, the Chinese economy is like clearly done so well from a standpoint of lifting people out of poverty and material abundance. So well over the last 10, 20, 30 years. Obviously better than any other country in the world. And the fact that it's still roughly replicating the same moods, et cetera, as anywhere else, I just think is like a very like as Claude would say, a point to sit with for a moment.
All right. Shall we leave it there?
Let's leave it there.
This has been another episode of the Odd Thoughts podcast. I'm Tracy Alloway. You can follow me at Tracy Alloway.
And I'm Joe Weisenthal. You can follow me at The Stalwart. Follow our guest, Dan Wang. He's at Dan W. Wang. Follow our producers, Carmen Rodriguez at Carmen Armin, Dashiell Bennett at Dashbot, Cale Brooks at Cale Brooks, and Kevin Lozano at Kevin Lloyd Lozano.
And for more Odd Lots content, you should check out our daily newsletter. You can find that at bloomberg.com/oddlots.
And you can chat about all of these topics 24/7 in our Discord, discord.gg/oddlots.
And if you enjoyed this conversation, then please leave a comment or like the video, or better yet, subscribe.
Thanks for watching.